This is Chapter 5, The American Revolution. This is going to be one of our longest chapters for obvious reasons. There's going to be a lot that we have to talk about, so hang in there. Again, I've tried to streamline it as much as possible, but it's the American Revolution, so there's some things you just can't cut out or it won't make any sense. So here we go, Chapter 5, The American Revolution. All right, to start, so we are now into the 18th century in British North America. Remember, 18th century means 1700s. And throughout the 1700s, the colonists are developing great emotional ties with Great Britain. Remember, they are British colonies. And so what that means to be a British colony is going to really define one of the causes of the American Revolution. Remember that they have just helped Great Britain, their country, to win a war, the French and Indian War, and they're very proud to be British because of this victory. But still, within a decade, some are going to decide that it is time to declare independence from Great Britain entirely. So how did this happen? Well, the revolution is going to be very important. It's going to build the institutions. It's going to solidify the language and ideas that define Americans' image of themselves. I mean, how you look at the revolution defines how you look at what it means to be an American. Not only that, it changes the course of history globally, not just in America. It begins the age of revolution. It's going to cause revolutions in other countries, in France, in Haiti, and different South American countries. And they are going to justify this new nation with many radical new ideas. But the revolution, however, is paradoxical in a lot of ways, meaning there are things that come about as a result of the revolution that don't seem to go together. For instance, the revolution was fought in the name of freedom, but yet it allowed slavery to persist after the revolution is won. The revolution was fought in part as a resistance to centralized authority. However, it brought about these disparate colonies together. These 13 individual colonies are brought together in this common cause. Politicians are eager to foster this Republican selflessness, but at the same time, they also encourage this rugged individual self-interest that really defines what it means to be American, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of attitude. And it joins the common colonists together in the fight. So it's not just going to be these small elite group of men, the founding fathers. It's going to be a lot of different people, a lot of common people. And the fact that they join in the fight unleashes popular forces that are really going to shape the revolution. All right, so first we're going to start looking at the origins of the American Revolution, and these are the long-term origins. So there's long-term causes, there's things that have been going on for, in some cases, almost 100 years. And then there's going to be immediate causes. So first we're going to talk about the long-term causes. So these are, again, things that they're going on over a long period of time. They're causing tension, and they're just simmering below the surface. They're not the immediate causes. We'll get to that in a minute. So going back in time here, between the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the mid-18th century, Britain is going to try and fail to define the colonial relationship within the empire. And why are they going to try to do this? Well, number one, Britain is pretty much consistently at war throughout this time period. And war is not only very politically consuming, it's also very expensive. And that expense is going to become very important in terms of those short-term causes, which we'll get to in a little bit. And the second reason is there are going to be competing visions of what it means to have an empire within Great Britain. So within Great Britain, there are different political parties that have different ideas of how the empire should be run. Remember, it's not just the 13 colonies that are going to become the United States. They have colonies in the Caribbean. They have colonies in Africa. They have colonies in Southeast Asia. They have a big empire. And so how do they want to organize that? What are all of these different disparate colonies? What is their relationship to the mother country? Well, a group of politics called the Old Whigs and the Tories believe in a very authoritarian kind of a relationship where the mother country, what they say goes. There's no room for dialogue. There's no democracy. the mother country is firmly in control. And they're also going to focus on conquering new territory and exacting resources from those territories, exacting raw materials, continuing to send it back to the mother country to be processed and manufactured in the same way that they've been doing. And they can get access to more raw natural resources by conquering new territories. And they can eliminate the debt incurred by all those different wars by increasing taxes and cutting spending on the colonies. So that's their vision of how to run an empire. On the other side, there are these radical or patriot Whigs who believe that the empire should be based on trade and manufacturing instead of just exacting raw materials. They believe that the economic growth that will result from focusing on trade and manufacturing will in and of itself solve the debt problem. And they believe that the colony should have equal status with the mother country. Now, colonists have their own understanding of their place in the empire. So the British have differing views within Great Britain of how the colonies, what is their place within the empire, and the colonists themselves have their own understanding of their place in the empire as well. They view themselves as entirely British subjects. They're not second-class British subjects. They are the same as any other person living in London or any other part of England would be. And as a result of that, they are entitled to all the rights of British subjects. And the 18th century also, remember, brought economic and demographic growth within the colonies. They're growing, they're becoming more prosperous, and a lot of this is believed to be because of Britain's very handoff approach. And remember, we talked about this in the previous chapter, that for most of colonial history, Britain was pretty hands-off. They got a lot going on in the mother country. And so because of that, they really just aren't as involved in the running of the day-to-day running of the colonies as they otherwise maybe would have been. And as a result, they believe that they have a special place within the empire and that this justifies the hands-off approach that Britain has. So here's a quote that really sums up, I think, what we're getting at here and how the colonists perceived themselves in terms of their place in empire. This is a quote from James Otis Jr. The colonists are entitled to as ample rights, liberties, and privileges as the subjects of the mother country are, and in some respects, to more. So again, they view themselves, in this case, not only the same as British subjects, but in some ways more important. Also remember that the colonists have developed their own political institutions that are really doing a lot of the day-to-day running of the colonies. They have colonial assemblies that are going to tax the residents, manage spending, grant salaries to royal officials, again, a lot of the day-to-day stuff. Colonial political power was also based on land, the same as Great Britain. If you had land, you could participate politically. That's going to be the case for a pretty fair amount of time in the United States also once we win our independence. However, the difference between the colonies and Great Britain is that land is more available in the colonies. And so that allows more men to participate in politics than they would back home in the mother country. The colonial political culture is also inspired by the Country Party in Great Britain. This is often referred to as the ideology of republicanism, and it's defined by the following characteristics. Number one, they believed in the corrupting nature of power. With great power comes great responsibility, but also corruption, the famous saying that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so there's a need for those involved in political power to be virtuous, meaning in this case, putting the public good above their own first. They also believe that patriots must be vigilant against conspiracies, centralized control, and tyranny. And these kinds of beliefs were not as widespread back home in Great Britain, but were extremely popular within the colonies. We've already talked a little bit about the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, but recall from previous chapters that the 1740s have these two movements, and that they both cause people to challenge ideas about authority. And probably the person who has the greatest impact, if we had to point to any one person in terms of the Enlightenment on the colonies, on colonial thinking, it would be John Locke. John Locke wrote his famous essay concerning human understanding, in which he said to some that the mind is a blank slate, or tabula rasa. So when you're born, your mind is just completely blank. You as a person are blank. And individuals are formed over time by their environment. So if we think about the whole nature versus nurture argument, here they're saying, Locke is saying it's all nurture. It's all dependent on your environment as you grow up. And as a result of this, he argues that the aristocracy are wealthy and successful because they have access to wealth and education, not because they are inherently superior. So he's saying that there's nothing inherently better about the aristocratic class in Great Britain. So these are the people who have titles, right? The lords and ladies of Great Britain is a very small group of people in which power and wealth is concentrated in Great Britain. And he's saying these people, there's nothing inherently special about them except that they're born into a privileged position. And so as a result, they have better education and better outcomes. Locke follows up on that with another essay called Some Thoughts on Education, and it introduced new ideas to the importance of education. So if you think back to what he had to say about the aristocracy and how they're not inherently better, they just have access to better education and more wealth. If you give everybody access to better education, then that's going to produce rational humans capable of thinking for themselves, who are going to question authority rather than just blindly accepting tradition. And these, as you can see, these kinds of ideas are going to have far-reaching consequences in the colony, where they're going to accept them as fact. And this is not something that everybody accepted to be a fact at the time. It's something we hold very dear in the United States, an idea that we really define as being American. But we have this saying in history that the past is like a foreign country. And so that means you can't take your modern worldview and the way that you look at, the way you look at the world today and impose it on people in the past. All the things all the developments in science and medicine and literature that have happened over time that you've experienced that they didn't experience in the past. You can't assume that they had the same way of looking at the world as you did. In some ways, maybe they did, but you can't make that assumption. And so these were radical thoughts. They're not radical to us now, but they were radical thoughts at the time. Again, we've already talked about the Great Awakening, so we won't go too far into it. But just to recap, the Reverend George Whitefield and others had a style of preaching and a message that was different from the rationalism of Locke, but in the same way caused people to question tradition and authority in the same way Locke did. Recall that they believed that salvation came from conversion experience, and because of this, one has to take responsibility for one's own unmediated relationship with God. So you have a personal relationship with God, and you are responsible for that relationship. And so again, it also inspires individuals to question authority and that take their own lives into their own hands. It's, again, in a more emotional, religious way, whereas Locke's is more, straight, rational, scientific way of looking at the world, but it has the same outcome and effect on the colonists. Remember that the colonists are becoming more culturally similar to the British as well, the mother country. As the economy grows, and we talked about this before in the previous chapters as well, the market revolution, the average colonist is going to have more disposable income that they can spend on British goods. And as a result of this, they can mimic British culture. They can buy British goods. They can, dress in the way that maybe the aristocracy can, even if they're just middle class. And so if their thinking becomes, well, if we can buy British goods, if we can live a life that is in some ways similar to the ruling class in Great Britain, we want the same liberties as those people as well. So throughout time, the political, intellectual, cultural, and economic developments that we've talked to are going to cause different tensions to rise to the surface, especially after the French and Indian War, when Britain starts implementing imperial reform that's going to conflict with the colonists' understanding of their place in the empire. So let's get now to the short-term causes. So those are all the long-term causes, the things that are happening slowly over time and building and building. Now, these are the things that are going to be more immediate causes to the revolution. So those immediate causes are going to be the various attempts at reform of the British Empire, specifically after the French and Indian War. So here we go. King George III is going to take the crown in 1760, and he's going to bring the Tories to power. And so to recall, the Tories are the ones who had that authoritarian vision of the empire. You know, what we say goes. You are not on equal footing with us. You are there to produce raw materials for us to manufacture and to extract from you, and that's about it. So that's the vision that they want to impose, and that's not the way that things were. Remember, the colonists have been largely pretty much governing themselves. And so when that authoritarian approach is imposed on them, they're going to be like, well, wait a minute, what's happening? This has not been the way we've run. And remember, it conflicts with their vision of who they are within the empire. They view themselves as, in most cases, just as good as, and in some better than the British citizens back home. So let's get into the various acts that they put in place. The first one is going to be the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and we briefly mentioned this as well. It's the first imperial action specifically targeting Native Americans. So remember, after the French and Indian War, the British gained pretty much all of the French territory of North America. So now they have all the land to the west of the Appalachian Mountains, whereas before they've pretty well been confined by the Appalachian Mountains. And if you look at that red line over there, that's the proclamation line. The proclamation line more or less follows the Appalachian Mountains. And it says, colonists, you can't go west of this line, and Native Americans are pretty much going to stay to the east. And it's trying to keep them apart. And the point is to limit costly wars. Remember, we talked about Pontiac's War, which was an uprising of Native Americans to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. They objected to British settlers pushing into their lands. And so it was very costly, very difficult for them to win. If you recall, they only won because they sent them blankets infected with smallpox. And they're like, well, how do we prevent this from happening again? Well, we'll just draw this line and tell the colonists they can't go past it. And problem solved. However, problem is not solved because the colonists believe, well, hey, we fought in the French and Indian War. We have the right to this land. We helped the mother country win it. We should be able to settle there. So they're not too happy about that. But things go on. And then in 1764, Parliament passes two more reforms. The first of which that we'll talk about is the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act was designed to combat widespread smuggling. So remember, technically the colonists are only supposed to send their goods through Great Britain. So some goods are going to go out to the rest of the world, but they have to go through Great Britain first. And they're only supposed to ship them on British ships. And so that's going to severely limit the amount of money that the colonists can earn because they have to use Great Britain as a middleman. And so as a result, there was a widespread culture of smuggling, and Britain had pretty much always looked the other way. Smugglers who were caught were usually tried on a jury of their peers, meaning other colonists, and because of that, they were typically acquitted. Now they're saying, we're not gonna go for that anymore. We're actually going to enforce the rule that you have to ship goods on British ships to Great Britain first. So they're actually going to cut the tax on sugar in half, but what they're going to do is they're going to increase the enforcement and prosecution of smugglers, and they're not going to allow the smugglers to be tried by a jury of their peers anymore. Second is going to be the Currency Act. This restricted the colonies from producing paper money. And paper money was already scarce, which we talked about in the last chapter. And because of this, this is going to impede trade even more. So the colonists start to fear that there's going to be this pattern of more taxes and less liberties. And that is exactly what's going to happen. So it carries on the next year in March of 1765 with the Stamp Act. Any document that was printed, any paper, anything, had to be stamped with a stamp like this, proving that a tax had been paid. So all paper products are now going to be taxed. They put the stamp on it to prove that the tax has been paid. It's kind of similar to when you go to the grocery store and you buy something that they can't bag and they put the little like jewel or whatever sticker on it proving that you paid for it. Similar kind of concept here. The stamp itself is proving that you paid the tax. This is actually the first direct tax on the colonies. And it not only affects the merchants in a way that maybe the Sugar Act is going to do, it's going to affect numerous groups of people. I mean, people need paper products. It's just the way it is. And so this is going to anger a lot of people. But again, it's not going to immediately cause a revolution, but we're getting there. Tension is building. And so resistance is going to start breaking out because of this. And it's going to take three different forms, and the forms that it takes are going to be distinguished by class. So let's start with the legislative resistance. This is done by the elites, the wealthy upper crust of colonial society. And they're going to respond to the series of taxes and different acts by passing different resolutions in assemblies. So again, it's a legislative response. For instance, they organized the Stamp Act Congress in 1765 to specifically address the issue of the Stamp Act. And within this meeting, they write and produce a document called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, in which they pledge their allegiance to the King and Parliament, but argue that they are entitled to the same rights as the British. Namely, A, that they have the right to a trial by jury, which was abridged by the Sugar Act, and B, they have a right to be taxed only by their own elected representatives. And so because these taxes are not coming from their own colonial assemblies, they're coming from Parliament, and they don't have a member of Parliament, they're arguing that that is not fair. You know, what do these people all the way in Great Britain, all the way in Parliament, know about what it's like to live in the colonies? We're an entire ocean away. And remember, think about how poor communication was back then in comparison to today. You know, how could they possibly know if this tax is fair or not? The only way they could know is if we had representation in Parliament, and we don't. And this is not fair. And as a result, it is constricting our liberties. There's going to be economic resistance, and this is going to be taken up by the merchant class. So you can kind of think of them as like the middle class, but specifically the people who trade, do a lot of trading. They're largely going to form non-importation agreements, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a refusal to import British goods. And their hope was that their counterparts, the British merchants, are going to be so economically hurt by this because they can't sell their British goods to the colonial merchants that they're going to lobby Parliament for a repeal. And that actually does happen. In January of 1766, a group of London merchants send a letter to Parliament asking for them to repeal some of these taxes. For everybody else, there are popular protests. So these are things that, again, everybody else, the common colonists, do. And what we mean by popular protests, we basically mean riots and various forms of intimidation. In 1766, the very famous group, the Sons of Liberty, are formed. In most colonies, there were different groups. There wasn't one Sons of Liberty. There were different cells of this group in all the colonies. And their purpose was to organize further resistance to these British acts. And they had the dual effect of sending a message to Parliament. You know, we don't agree with what you're doing, and here's how we're going to show it through riots and intimidation, and also discouraging colonists to accept appointments as stamp collectors. So they so opposed the Stamp Act that they would intimidate anybody who maybe would accept an appointment as a royal tax collector for the Stamp Act. And so if there's no people in the colonies to collect the tax on the stamps, how can you enforce the act? Well, you can't. And so as a result, Parliament does repeal the Stamp Act in February of 1766. But they also passed the Declaratory Act at the same time, which says, all right, in a nutshell, this is what it says. All right, we repealed the Stamp Act, it's gone, but we reserve the right to impose all future taxes. So basically saying, just so you know, we're still in charge here. They also passed the Townshend Acts in June of 1767, and these outline new custom duties on common items like lead, glass, paint, and tea. And now it's not a direct tax, it's a custom duty. However, it is still like a tax in a roundabout way. It's something that when these items are shipped into colonial ports, there's going to have to be a tax paid. So you, the consumer, aren't directly paying it, but the merchants are paying it, and they don't like that. Also, they send new officials and juries to enforce these acts. And so this results in the increased presence of the British government in the colonies. But still, even though, again, they're not technically taxes, the colonists were going to refer to these as taxes. And they ask themselves, well, what's going to stop the British from imposing more taxes? Remember, up until this point, there may have been taxes or duties, and again, there might have been rules about shipping and this and that, but nobody was really enforcing them. Now, all of a sudden, they have this new authoritarian approach, and the colonists are saying, whoa, 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 this is not what we're used to. Where's this going to stop? Where's our right in all of this? Where's our voice? So there are going to be new forms of resistance in which the elite, middle, and working classes are going to participate together. We, of course, have somewhat of a class system here in America, but it's not as rigid as in Great Britain. Even today, they have a much more rigid class system where they have an aristocracy where you just can't work really hard and be a member of the aristocracy, right? it's something that you're born into. And so the fact that you have these classes working together is really unique at the time. So merchants are going to form more and more non-importation agreements. And on the other side, everybody else is going to agree not to consume British products. Women are also getting involved. They are circulating lists with signatories of people who are promising not to buy British goods, participating in this boycott.
They're going to be writing political commentary, and they're going to be doing more everyday things to emphasize their disagreement with this. For instance, making spinning clubs where they made homespun cloth so that they wouldn't have to import British cloth. They're wearing their own, right? And it's a form of protest. And it might seem like a very small thing, but again, if everybody's doing it and nobody's buying British cloth, that's going to hurt the merchants in Great Britain. They in turn are going to lobby Parliament to stop this so that they can get their businesses back going. So it's going to have a larger effect. So all these non-importation and non-consumption actions are going to forge unity amongst these different classes and groups of people. Colonies are also going to form committees of correspondence, and their job is basically to keep other colonies informed of resistance efforts. Because again, today we think about, 13 colonies, and it's been ingrained in us since grade school, 13 British colonies. So we kind of think of them as being all one, but they really were 13 very distinct colonies, and almost like their own little nations in a way, although they are all British. And so the colonies actually coming together to work together on something is definitely a big change. So, for example, when the Boston Massacre occurs in March 5th of 1770, it's going to have effects outside of Boston. So what happened here? Well, British regiments are sent to Boston to impose taxes and to stop resistance. We consider Massachusetts and Boston in particular to be the cradle of the Revolution. It's why they have their very famous Freedom Trail there that you can go and you can tour all
these significant sites in which these important events happened in the Revolution. And Massachusetts in general tended to be the most resistant to these acts. So there's a sentry on duty at the Custom House, which is where they kept all the important documents and the tax revenue. And there's a small group of Bostonians who come and they're mocking the sentry. They're throwing things at the sentry. They're maybe being a little bit more abusive than that. And more British soldiers are going to come to his aid because, again, the crowd's getting pretty hostile. The crowd's going to get more hostile. And it ends up that there are shots fired by the British. And 5 Bostonians are dead, including the leader of this group, Crispus Attucks, who was actually a former slave and the first African-American to die in the course of the Revolution. Now, the British soldiers, surprisingly, are actually acquitted, even though you have a jury of Boston colonists who are going to sit in judgment on them. They were actually defended by John Adams, which is surprising to a lot of people because John Adams is one of the founding fathers. He fought and he pushed for the Revolution, but actually he, early on in the Revolutionary history, defended these British soldiers, and it actually turned out
that their commander did not order them to fire, that a colonist had actually hit one of the British soldiers on the head, and it caused his rifle to actually accidentally discharge. In the meantime, the crowd were yelling, fire, fire, why don't you fire? And so they heard the shot go off, they hear people yelling fire, and there was confusion, and they fired even though they weren't, their commander never told them to. So they were acquitted, but still the news of what had happened at the Boston Massacre spread very quickly, mostly because of this famous Paul Revere engraving, which is actually not an accurate representation of what happened. For one, it happened at night. This makes it look like it's in broad daylight. 2, the commander was actually standing in front of his men. So if he's in front of his men, why would he ask them to fire? He's going to risk himself being shot. They were not in neat formation. Again, only 5 people died. This makes it look like it's way more. And so it's very misleading, but it does its job, and that's to stir up anger amongst the people against the British soldiers. So there's a lot of unrest, not just in Massachusetts, but in all the colonies as a result of this as news spreads. And to try to calm things down, in March of 1770, Parliament does repeal all taxes and duties except for one small one on tea. So as a result, tensions do ease for the most part after the Boston Massacre. However, the need for reform remains. The British government wants to keep the colonies quiet, but they still have this massive debt that they have to pay off, and part of that debt was caused by the French and Indian War and Pontiac's War, which were fought on behalf of the colonists, and they feel like, the colonists got to start paying their fair share. So in April of 1773, there is the Regulating Act. The Regulating Act comes about because the British East India Trading Company is having some problems. They've fallen behind on their payments to the government. They have 15 million pounds of tea in warehouses that they can't sell. And so as a result, they are placed under government control. The government then passes the Tea Act, which says that the British East India Trading Company can now sell tea directly to the colonies without an import duty. So they can sell to the colonies and they don't have to pay a tax. This is actually going to make the tea cheaper to the colonists because in order to turn a profit, the British East India Trading Company doesn't have to they don't have to charge the tax, so they don't have to charge the consumer as much. However, you'd think that this would make the colonists happy because they pay less for tea. It actually makes them mad because they're saying, well, now the British East India Trading Company can sell tea at such a low price that they are going to have a monopoly. We have to buy their tea, and we can't buy whatever other tea we want. And they feel that by buying the tea that they're basically being forced to buy and paying the duty, they're basically acknowledging the right of Parliament to tax. And again, they don't think that Parliament has that right. Now, the duty would be paid when the ship was unloaded. So ship comes in, it's got all this tea, they unload the ship, the merchant pays the tax. So the Sons of Liberty in Boston, again, led by Samuel Adams and John Hancock, worked to prevent the unloading of the ships in December of 1773 in protest to these acts. And after a town meeting in Boston, a group of men dressed up as Mohawk Native Americans and board the ships and dump the tea into the harbor. And this is repeated in other cities as well, this same act throughout the rest of 1773 and into 1774 as an act of protest. And the Boston Gazette, which is a newspaper in Boston at the time, had this to say about the Boston Tea Party. But behold what followed, a number of brave and resolute men, determined to do all in their power to save their country from the ruin which their enemies had plotted, and in less than 4 hours emptied every chest of tea on board the 3 ships, amounting to 342 chests into the sea, without the least damage done to ships or other property. So not only saying, hey, this was a peaceful protest in a way, but also referring to the British East India Trading Company and by default the British government as the enemies of the colony, which is pretty significant. So now what's going to happen? Well, now Great Britain's mad. They're like, look, we tried to calm things down. We tried to give you tea that was cheaper than the tea you had before, and this is the thanks we get. Now you're in trouble. And they pass a series of 4 acts, which the British called the Coercive Acts and the colonists call the Intolerable Acts. And they're purposely done to punish Boston, where the Boston Tea Party, of course, happened. So the port of Boston is completely shut down. All trade is cut off from the city of Boston. The colonial government of Massachusetts is placed under British control. And they declare that all royal officials tried in Britain are going to be tried in Britain. So if something were to happen, like the Boston Massacre, those soldiers would no longer be tried where the crime happened. They would be tried back home in Great Britain. And they also passed the Quartering Act, which says British soldiers can stay in colonial homes. British soldier gets shipped to the colonies in order to help enforce these acts. They can come up to your house, knock on the door, say, hey, I'm staying here, and you have to allow it. So those committees of correspondence, which we talked about before, those groups that are, pretty much there to keep the colonies informed of resistance to these acts, get together, and they agreed to send delegates to the First Continental Congress to help more coordinate the colonial response to now these intolerable acts. So they meet starting in September 5th of 1774. Delegates from all colonies but Georgia are going to come. They're going to produce many documents, but they include the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which are basically repeating the arguments that we've talked about so far. Colonists have the same rights as the British, mainly the right to representation and trial by jury, which now has been taken away even more by the Intolerable Acts. They produced another document, the Continental Association, which says that there should be a committee chosen in every town. It should be made up of common colonists. And basically what these committees are going to do is they're going to police communities and publish the names of those working against the colonists. So everybody's going to know, and they're going to basically shame them for working against their fellow colonists. They're also going to form more non-importation and non-consumption groups. And this is probably the most radical because this is going to unite and direct 12 different revolutionary governments to act together. They're going to establish economic and moral policies and empower common colonists through political power. Now, not all colonists are patriots. Not all agree with these acts. Many remain faithful to the king and to Parliament. Many are neutral. And by 1775, factions within the resistance movement themselves are also going to emerge. A lot of elite merchants who primarily trade with Great Britain are becoming increasingly concerned. The Anglican clergy as well are concerned. Also, colonists who hold royal offices are concerned. And so they're hoping to be a moderating influence in this resistance. Remember, the resistance doesn't start off as, okay, we're going to establish a new country. It's mainly to protest what Britain is doing and hopefully get some representation in Parliament and have a repeal of all these different taxes. And now people are seeing this is maybe going to a more radical step. This is maybe aimed at independence, whereas many people still expected at this point that there could be a peaceful conciliation with Great Britain, and that, again, those different things could happen. Representation in Parliament, repeal of these taxes, and we'll go on our merry way. So by the time the Second Continental Congress meets again in May of 1775, war has already broken out unofficially. It happens, surprise, surprise, in Massachusetts in April of 1775 at Lexington and Concord, the famous shot heard round the world, the battle that starts it all, the first battle of the American Revolution. So what happened? Well, British regiments were sent to seize the local militias, arms and powder stores, and the towns of Lexington and Concord, so seize their weapons. And the town militia hears about it, and they meet at the Lexington Green, and a battle breaks out between these colonial militia and the British Army. The battle continues on the road to Concord, and as it goes along, all these different militia members, also known as Minutemen, respond, and they're actually able to drive the British back to Boston. So if you think about this for a minute, we take for granted the fact that we win the American Revolution, but it's pretty unlikely. If you look at this picture, look at the militiamen that are in the foreground. They're just like regular people who, grab their hunting rifle and run off against the trained British Army, the most powerful army in the world. And they have success. They win this battle. I mean, it's completely unexpected that this would happen. So they're driven back to Boston, and about 20,000 colonial militiamen then take it further and lay siege to Boston. And in June, they fortify Breed's Hill around the city. And a battle ensues. It's misnamed and called the Battle of Bunker Hill, when actually it takes place on Breed's Hill. But the British start assaulting the hill, as you can see the picture over there on the right. They're charging up the hill, trying to take it back from the colonists. And they do win, but they suffer severe casualties in the process. So again, you have this colonial militia. They're not trained soldiers. They're just random people who have access to some sort of weapon. And even though they lose this one, they hold their own, right? They don't just get completely slaughtered by the British Army. The British have a hard time winning this battle. So again, this is very shocking to people at the time. So the radical Massachusetts delegates want the Second Continental Congress to support the Massachusetts militia. And they're led by the now a patriot John Adams, his cousin Samuel Adams, and John Hancock. But moderates worry that this will mean declaring war. And remember, not everybody's on board with the whole independence thing. Delegates from Massachusetts, a lot of people in Massachusetts, sure, not everybody else. So they decide to compromise. They agree that they will adopt the Massachusetts militia and form a Continental Army with George Washington as their commander-in-chief. And they issue basically an explanation for why they're doing so, called the Declaration of the Causes of Necessity of Taking Up Arms, which is, the title is pretty self-explanatory there. But the other part of the compromise is that they also draft the Olive Branch Petition, which is, olive branch. Extending the olive branch means, trying to reach out in terms of peace. So they send this petition to the king saying, all right, fighting has broken out, but we still don't want to declare war. We don't want to declare independence. We still want to be a part of the colonies. What can we do? Well, the king dismisses the speech in Parliament, and by early of 1776, pretty much everybody is recognizing that a reconciliation between the colonies and Great Britain is pretty much growing dim at this. And by 1776, the topic of independence is now becoming popular debate. And a lot of this is because of a 46-page pamphlet written by actually somebody who was British and moved to the colonies, Thomas Paine. And it convinces many people that this is the right step. It's called Common Sense. And his easy language, biblical references, and fiery rhetoric really inspires people that know independence is actually the right. So here's a quote from Common Sense. There is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. So we are pretty much at war here. Fighting is going to break out, and the British are going to respond. And one of the acts that they do is actually kind of surprising given the time. The Royal Governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, offers freedom to all slaves and indentured servants who join the British Army. Initially, only 500 follow through with this, but later thousands will. This is a pretty surprising move. Now, it's practical rather than humanitarian. He's not doing it necessarily because he believes slavery is wrong. He's doing it because he wants to undermine the power of wealthy colonists and to give the British Army an advantage over the colonists. And it really frightens a lot of white Southerners. Part of this is because 4 years earlier there was a case back in Great Britain, Somerset versus Stuart, in which a slave by the name of James Somerset sued for his freedom and actually won. And again, this took place
In Great Britain, but they were still British colonies, so it affects the British as well. And so that decision, plus now Lord Dunmore's actions, convinced many Southerners that, hey, maybe that an independent nation would be better able
to protect slavery, because it looks like the British are on the path of, declaring slavery to be wrong, and indeed they do pretty shortly thereafter. And so a lot of these Southern planters actually were the ones who were on the fence about declaring independence with Great Britain. You think about it from their economic perspective. They're growing raw materials and sending it to Great Britain. That's what they do. That's how they make their money. And so declaring independence from Great Britain would upset that balance. But now the threat of slavery maybe being done away with is going to convince them to join the Patriot cause. By May 10th of 1776, Congress resolves to have all colonies form their own government. And they tell them to start preparing state constitutions. And this is really Congress's first quote-unquote Declaration of Independence. On June 7th, Delegate Richard Henry Lee of the Second Continental Congress offers a resolution that independence should be declared. And on July 2nd, it passes 12-0 in favor. New York, which was then under threat of invasion from the British Army, obviously abstains, but everybody else votes in favor. So the Continental Congress votes in favor of declaring independence, but there's a feeling that there should be some sort of public declaration that this is happening that should go out to all the colonies. And so they have Thomas Jefferson and some others, but mainly Thomas Jefferson, draft this Declaration of Independence. Now, the majority of the document is a list of the specific grievances that the colonies have with Great Britain. And neither these grievances nor the rhetoric of the preamble is new. It's really the culmination of the popular resistance to the reform and the long-term developments in the colonies that we've been repeating over and over again. And it's famously approved on July 4th, 1776, hence why we celebrate our independence on July 4th, 1776. Now, the very famous painting to the right of Jefferson presenting the Declaration at the Continental Congress is also historically misleading. It was approved on July 4th, but the delegates were in and out that whole summer, rushing in between the Continental Congress and back home to their colonies and whatnot. So not everybody was there to sign it on July 4th, but it is the painting that is popular in our mind as to how this all occurred. And of course, a famous quote from the Declaration of Independence: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. So now that you see the kind of the build up to this, you can understand where this rhetoric is coming from. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the battles, not a lot of them. This is not a military history course. This is what we call a survey course. So if you're pursuing history as a possible major, you can take a military history course as you get further up down the line and learn more about that. But we're just going to get a quick overview here. So in the summer of 1776, the British decide to abandon Boston, which is where they were when we last left off, and go to New York. And in New York City, we have the largest expeditionary force in British history arriving. And it includes thousands of German mercenaries called Hessians. What they want is to control the Hudson River by controlling New York City, and as a result, to isolate pretty much all of New England. The Continental Army, in the face of this giant invasion from Great Britain, retreats to New Jersey. And Washington realizes that, hey, we're in a pretty bad position. This huge British force, the might of the British Army is here. All these German mercenaries are here. It's not looking good. And he realizes that he needs to lift morale and encourage people to re-enlist in the army. So he needs a very decisive victory. And so he does a sneak attack. He attacks a Hessian army camp on Christmas Day when everybody's sleeping off their Christmas Eve revelries. And it's a huge victory and a very needed victory to, again, boost morale and boost people to re-enlist.
But probably his greatest success is
the Battle of Saratoga, which takes place, of course, in upstate New York in 1777, where Saratoga is. And this is a Patriot victory over the British General William Howe. And why it's so significant is not just because it's a victory, it's because this victory specifically convinces France to start openly supporting the colonial cause. They had been secretly sending supplies here and there to the colonies, not because they supported, our cause or the rhetoric behind it. They are still an absolute monarchy at this time, and so they certainly don't agree with that. It's because they have this ongoing feud with Britain, and they'd love nothing more than to see Britain thwarted. Now they're going to openly be our allies in this war. So we have a major European country now fighting on our side. This is a huge turning point for the colonists. And it also turns this into a global war in Europe and in India as well. So
General Howe of the British Army, which we just mentioned, now realizes
that European military tactics are not working in North America. In Europe, armies fight head-on battles, and the purpose of these are to seize and control major cities. But by 1777, the British hold major cities, including Philadelphia and New York, but they're still in a very weakened position. On the flip side, General Washington has this untrained Continental Army, and he realizes they can't win those types of battles with the British Army. And so he develops his own logic of warfare, in which the Continental Army is going to fight smaller, more frequent little skirmishes instead of big, drawn-out battles. And in this way, the war can continue no matter how many cities the British take, because it's not about the major cities, it's about these small hit-and-run skirmish battles.
By 1778, the British
decide to focus their military efforts on the South. They have more popular support in the South for the reasons I just mentioned before. A lot of the planters feel very connected economically to Great Britain. And again, they're going to capture the major cities of the South, but they don't have the manpower to retain control. And again, the colonists are fighting a completely different war, in which it doesn't matter if you take the cities, they're not really focused on that. Also, by 1781, they are fighting wars in France, Spain, and Holland. Public support for the war is very low. And again, the war is costly because wars are costly. And so things are going to start to head south pretty quickly for the British. In October of 1781, Washington moves his troops
to Virginia. And the point here
is to trap the British Army under the control of General George Cornwallis. Here, they are dug in
at the city of Yorktown, and they're awaiting reinforcements from New York. However, the Continental and French armies get there before their reinforcements, and the French Navy also arrives, and this forces the British General George Cornwallis to surrender to George Washington. As a result of this, peace negotiations begin in France, and the war officially ends on September 3rd, 1783, with the Treaty of Paris. So Americans begin celebrating. This is huge. I mean, this is very unlikely that these ragtag army, the group of colonists, are going to come together and defeat the most powerful nation in the world. It's just unbelievable. But even though it's a great victory, the war has great costs. The soldiers have suffered in these years through brutal winters and inadequate resources. For example, the famous winter at Valley Forge, 1777 to 1778, is very brutal, and 2,500 soldiers die of disease and exposure at this time. Life's also not easy on the home front. Women are left alone as their husbands go off to war to care for households. And everybody is impacted. Black Americans are also impacted. Remember that the British Army are the first to recruit specifically enslaved labor. Washington later allows former slaves to join the army and to earn their freedom. So, for example, in 1775, a former slave named Peter Salem joined the militia. He fought at Lexington and Concord, and as a result, earned his freedom. So there are going to be long and short-term consequences. The most immediate consequences are we are going to start seeing written state constitutions. And these state constitutions are an innovation, and they set the stage for the Constitution, the federal Constitution, later on. The British Constitution was traditionally unwritten. It was kind of a hodgepodge of a lot of different documents. And these state governments are going to be based on the idea of popular sovereignty, the fact that power and authority of the government is derived from the people. They set up generally weak governors and strong legislatures with regular elections, and most have a Bill of Rights in the Constitution protecting the rights of individuals and specifically outlining the powers of the government in a direct response to the fact that the British government, in the eyes of the colonists, had taken away their rights. Now they want to make sure that, okay, we're going to establish a new government, but that government's not going to take away the people's rights too. There are also going to be political and social changes in the average everyday life of people. Political participation is going to grow. More people can vote and participate. Society is going to become more egalitarian, and more common citizens are able to participate in the government. However, the revolution does have its limits. Many women do serve the patriot cause, sometimes in battle, as the famous Molly Pitcher did, but they did not achieve equality in the end. Also, there was a clause in the Treaty of Paris that was supposed to protect the lands of loyalists. However, throughout the 1780s, states seized the loyalist property. By 1783, many formerly enslaved loyalists fled with the British Army. The fight for liberty led some people to free their slaves, and this starts a gradual emancipation of slaves, mainly in the North. Most northern states pass either immediate or gradual emancipation laws. And the revolution's rhetoric of equality created this revolutionary generation of enslaved and freed people who are going to then turn around and fight for emancipation throughout the United States. However, the revolution failed to reconcile slavery with these new egalitarian principles, and this is going to cause tensions that are going to build until the Civil War. It's a problem that they don't solve and leave off to later generations to handle, and it's going to cause another destructive war. Native Americans also participated in the war. Many sided with the British. The Shawnee, Creek, Cherokee, and Iroquois all sided with the British because they hoped the British would continue to resist colonial settlers moving west in the way that they did with the Proclamation Line. However, the American victory and the Native American support for the British made created this pretense for a rapid and brutal expansion west. And so the Native Americans will continue to be displaced and pushed further west throughout the 19th century. So to conclude, the Revolutionary War officially frees the colonists from British rule. We are now our own country. It offers the first blow in the age of democratic revolutions. So there's going to be similar revolutions in France, Haiti, different South American countries. The revolution was won not just by the founding fathers, but by men and women of all ranks. However, it did not end all social and civic inequalities. However, but at the same time, the rhetoric of the revolution of equality helped to highlight the inequalities and shaped future political movements. So again, to go back to what we said at the beginning, how you understand the revolution dictates what it means to be an American to you. Which leads to this chapter question, which is, what was the most important consequence of the American Revolution? Of course, make sure you cite specific examples explaining your view. But that wraps up Chapter 5, the American Revolution. I know that was a long one. There's really no way to do it any shorter than that. Again, I streamlined it as much as I could, but there you have it. Thanks for sticking with me, and we'll see you in Chapter 6.